All right. I'll keep an eye on the waiting room, but just to be respectful of everyone's time, I'm going to go ahead and get started. If you've been to the last few of these, I probably do not look familiar to you. I'm Danielle Afsorda. I'm the Community Outreach Archivist for the Butler Center for Arkansas Studies. I'm Heather Standen this month. She's taking a much needed vacation. Um, this is the fourth in the 5-part series, Let's Talk About It, Women's Suffrage Discussions. Thanks for taking the time to join us this evening. After the program is over, a brief survey will appear in the browser window. If you take a minute to complete that, I'd appreciate it. That helps us for reporting for our grant purposes and will enable us to get more of these fun grants in the future. So thanks for that. Tonight, we're going to be discussing Ida B. Queen, the extraordinary life and legacy of Ida B. Wells. And I'd like to thank the American Library Association and the National Endowment for Humanities for their support of this project. Over the course of this 5-part series, we're joined by scholars of women's history, and tonight we're joined by project scholar Dr. Cherisse Jones-Branch from the Arkansas State University in Jonesboro. Dr. Jones-Branch is the James and Wanda Lee Vaughn Professor of History, Dean of the Graduate School at Arkansas State University, and a 2021-2022 American Council on Education Lumina Fellow at the University of Central Arkansas. A native of Charleston, South Carolina, she received her BA and MA from the College of Charleston and a doctorate in history from the Ohio State University. Dr. Jones-Branch is the author of Crossing the Line, Women and Interracial Activism in South Carolina During and After World War II, and co-editor of Arkansas Women, Their Lives and Times. Her second manuscript, Better Living by Their Own Bootstraps, Black Women's Activism in Rural Arkansas, 1913 to 1965, is now available from the University of Arkansas Press. Highly recommend that one. It's a great read. Jones-Branch is currently working on a third book project titled To Make the Farm Bureau Stronger and Better for All the People, African Americans and the American Farm Bureau Federation, 1920 to 1966. Dr. Jones-Branch is additionally a U.S. Army Persian Gulf War veteran. In this evening's session, we're going to start off with a short presentation from Dr. Jones-Branch before starting the book discussion. If at any time during the program you experience a technical issue, just feel free to shoot me a message in the chat and I'll do my best to help you troubleshoot. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Dr. Jones-Branch.
Thank you so very much for that introduction. Good evening, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well. I hope everyone is inside and cool in this weather. It's kind of hot around here, right? I'm actually going to be going to a conference in Norway on Tuesday. Yes, I got a flight Tuesday night, and I'm looking forward to temperatures in the 60s. So I can't wait. Again, thank you for spending some time here with me this afternoon talking about Ida B. the Queen, the extraordinary legacy and life of Ida B. Wells Barnett. I'm going to assume that most, if not all of you, or at least some of you have heard of her before. And I will just give you a little bit of background on her, but I think it's really important for us to talk about this book because I know some of you have attended other sessions on women's suffrage, but when we talk about people like Ida B. Wells Barnett and her story and her activism, there's a whole lot going on that includes suffrage, challenges because of sexism, challenges because of racism. And she's very clearly a woman who had her hands in some of everything. I think some people would say that she was a woman before her time, but she really wasn't, because if you do the research, you'll find that there are lots of other women who were just like her. So in fact, her activism wasn't that unusual to Black women like her at the time in which she lived. And so I'm just going to move on to my next slide here. I put together a brief PowerPoint presentation, not anything too terribly fancy, but I always think that when I'm speaking, it's helpful for people to also have images to look at. And so what we do know about Ida B. Wells Barnett is that she was a prolific writer. She began her life, of course, in Mississippi. She was born enslaved. Her family had been born enslaved, and this is covered in the book. And then her parents die, and one of her siblings die, and she immediately has to assume the reins to make sure that the rest of her family makes it through. And she does just that. She becomes an educator. And it's very, very early on in her life that she starts challenging racism, Jim Crow laws, and things of that sort. And I think it's important for us to start from that place because we tend to think of civil rights activists as people who were functioning largely in the 1950s. Well, by the time we get to 1931, Ida B. Wells Barnett has passed on to the ancestors, but she spent an entire life engaged in civil rights activism. And a lot of this activism came through her writings. So we're talking about things like in 1892 when she wrote Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in all of its phases. We can talk about things like the lynching of the 3 African-American men in Memphis in 1892. One of my dogs is making an appearance. My apologies. Well, you can't really see her, but this is a lifetime of activism and writing that we can still look back to this day to really understand the longer trajectory of civil rights activism in this country. And so when I've taught courses on the civil rights movement, I always impress upon my students that Black people didn't just start getting a clue about their oppression in 1955. They were aware and they've been fighting it all along. And there are millions of people who were engaged in this kind of activism whose names we're never going to know. But trust me when I tell you, they were there. And Ida B. Wells was the sort of woman who in her writings told truths that everybody knew, but people preferred not to hear. She was honest, she was very direct, she was blatant in her criticisms about what was going on in the country and in the world at that time, particularly as it pertained to African Americans. And it did cost her, but the cost didn't stop her. In fact, one could argue that the cost made her that much more determined to continue on with her civil rights activism. It also talks in the book about how she was a founder of numerous organizations that still exist to this very day. And one of them is the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, which was founded in 1896. And she was among the co-founders. She was friends with the first president, a woman named Mary Church Terrell, who was actually from Memphis, Tennessee. And this organization still exists today. Most of the states have state chapters of the organizations, and then there are local organizations below that. In Arkansas, for example, the Arkansas Association of Colored Women was affiliated and it remains affiliated with this organization. I'm a member. I'm a member of one of these local federated clubs in Blytheville, Arkansas, although I live in Jonesboro. And so this club still exists. It's well over 100 years old, and its objective remains the same as its motto: lifting as we climb, improving Black communities, empowering Black women, providing for African-American families. And that's the same in 2022 as it was when the National Association of Colored Women was founded in 1896, 4 years before the turn of the 20th century. And this is just a plaque celebrating Ida B. Wells Barnett's activism. And I think what's also important for us to know about Ida B. Wells Barnett was that she was an international activist. You read the book, so you know that she went on an anti-lynching tour in Britain. She went to Germany. She traveled to a number of other places to make sure people were aware of the atrocities that were happening in the United States. And another thing that I think is very important about her activism for people to know, and they typically do not know, is that she's one of the co-founders of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Most commonly, people will associate that organization with W.E.B. Du Bois, and that's fine. But what they failed to realize was that he did not single-handedly found that organization. There were women there. Mary Church Terrell, again from Memphis, Tennessee, was one of the co-founders of the organization. So it's very interesting that we have these two Black women who were from the Mid-South, because as you know, Ida B. Wells was from Mississippi, Mary Church Terrell was from Memphis, not too far away. And they go on to be these major movers and shakers and African-American women leaders in the late 19th and in the early 20th century. And as I said, when we think about the founding of organizations, now this organization, the Negro Fellowship League, no longer exists, but it's just an example of one of the many, many, many organizations that Ida B. Wells Barnett either helped to found, was president of, or was involved in some way, just because of the myriad issues that African Americans were facing in the late 19th and early 20th century. So, for example, she also was a member of an Equal Rights League organization. You read in the book where she established the Illinois Suffrage Club. And all of this connects to suffrage in this very important way. She understood that as a Black woman in late 19th century, early 20th century America, that suffrage was not just about being a woman. Suffrage was about Black people having the right to vote, the right to determine who's going to represent them, the right to have people represent them who would enact laws that would protect them and ensure that they had access to their rights as American citizens. And of course, again, because you've read the book, you know she had a very complicated relationship with white suffrage activists who were often more wedded to their racial interests than their gender interests. And I think that's something that we have to keep in mind, because that kind of thinking and those struggles between women of color and white women activists and suffragists span the entire course of the 20th century. So if you were to look at the suffrage movement or the women's movement in the late 1960s into the 1970s, some of these same issues are apparent. As in, how do you talk about what's important for women if you're not willing to parse out the issues that are particularly important to women from underrepresented backgrounds? And people like Ida B. Wells Barnett were questioning all of this in the first years of the 20th century. And if we're looking at 1916, she's obviously questioning and challenging this during World War I. And she makes it into a lot of newspapers because there are tons of African American owned and operated newspapers at this point. One of the things that I enjoy doing as I work on my next book is looking at the African American newspaper database. And most of those newspapers are no longer in operation, but I think it's fascinating to be able to look at them to see what they're talking about and compare and contrast that to what they might be talking about in mainstream newspapers. And you're able to glean a lot about what Black people are doing in the country throughout the years that you are not likely to see in mainstream newspapers. And that's not necessarily the case across the board, but more often than not, that is in fact the case. So you see here the example of the Negro Fellowship League, President Ida B. Wells Barnett. So she's the one who's in charge, right? She's the one who's spearheading this effort. And she's the one who is going around the country to places like Topeka, Wichita, Kansas, so on and so forth. And she's encouraging people to fight for their rights, to get registered to vote. And as you read in the book, she's also the one who's challenging politicians and presidents and governors and individuals like that and saying things like American citizens are being murdered. What are you going to do about it? This is an atrocity. And I dare say I know she probably went so far as to say, I've been to Britain and Germany, and they're looking at Americans and saying, what in the world are you doing? You're killing your own people. And again, we're talking about the 19 teens, but similar arguments are made by other activists later on in the 20th century. And I really appreciated how Michelle Duster, and I've met her on a couple of occasions, intersperse the story of her great grandmother with more contemporary acts, more contemporary situations, most notably the Crown Act that was passed in 2020. One of the things that talked about in the book was how she wore her hair in its natural state at a time when a lady, a well-groomed and dressed Black woman, did not wear her hair in its natural state. And so this is an act that was passed in 2020, but rest assured, this was not a new situation as of 2020. This goes all the way back to Ida B. Wells and beyond that point. So even at this point in our history, she is encouraging Black people to move in the world as they are originally and organically. And that's not a new concept as of 2020. Okay, just gonna move on here just a little bit because I do want to get to talking about this. That's half the fun, right? It's not fun listening to me talk, it's fun talking to you. This is an example here of the lynching in 1892, and I just took this out of one of the many newspapers I spend time looking at when I'm not doing Dean things. And one of the things that was so important about the power of the pen for Ida B. Wells and people like her is because they spoke truth to what was actually happening and the reasoning behind this violence, these ritualistic murders of Black people and African American men in particular. But she speaks truths to them when she says things like, they claim it was because they were rioting or behaving in some sort of antisocial way, or they had sexually assaulted a white woman, which could mean something as simple as not stepping off the sidewalk when she passed by. So all of these charges were greatly exaggerated. And in more instances than not, in most instances, in fact, it was because many of these people were asserting themselves in a world that didn't believe Black people had the right to do that. And often, many of these people are only antisocial to the extent that they're doing well. And so that was the case with these three men, McDowell, Moss, and Stewart, who were friends of hers, who were murdered in 1892. They were not rabble rousers, they were business owners, and their business just happened to be more successful than their white competition. And if you look at the newspapers from 1892, this makes newspapers all around the country and all around the globe. So news doesn't travel as quickly at this point as it does today. You know, you can get something from on the other side of the world in, you know, nanoseconds, but it traveled quickly enough in the late 19th century. And I want to make a point about her suffrage activism, since that's a lot of what we're here to talk about. As you said in the book, as Michelle Duster said about her great grandmother, she refused to be pushed to the margins. So you can go into newspapers.com, you got to pay for it, but you can go into newspapers.com and find this very same article in the Chicago Tribune, March 5th, 1913. It's in the book, but I wanted to go find it because I wanted to see it more closely for myself. And so even though some of her friends, her compatriots, wanted her to marginalize herself so as to not upset Southern white suffragists, she said, no, I'm not going to do that. You are going to see me. I'm going to show up in this space. I'm going to take up space and I'm going to claim it. And so the arrow that I have here is pointing to Ida B. Wells Barnett. And if you could see on the other side of it, I know the print is a little difficult to read, she's named in this article as one of the Black women who marches. And she very intentionally wanted to be seen and wanted to be in the newspaper, because this makes a tremendous statement that, no, I'm not going to be marginalized. No, you are going to see me. And yes, you are going to hear me. And that's just the kind of person she was. And again, suffrage activism informed a lot of her life. So this is just an ad. It mentions the Alpha Suffrage Club in the book. I just went and found another article of my own, and we're talking about Negro women who are politically active. This is not something that they become engaged in, you know, as of the 1950s and 1960s. They're doing this in 1913. They're doing it before 1913. But this is the moment at which she establishes this organization, because as you all read, Illinois gives women the right to vote in certain kinds of elections, but she's pushing for more than this. She's saying that we deserve this at the state level, the local level, the national level, all of that. And so she forms this organization to support that effort. And I think the other thing that's important to keep in mind, this is in the book as well, is that she was a Republican, right? And the thing we have to understand is that at this point, the Republican Party is the progressive party. It's the party of Lincoln. It's the party that allegedly emancipated African Americans. It's the party that Black people are loyal to for a very, very long time. And in places like the state of Arkansas, that loyalty lasts until the mid 1970s. Okay. All right. Again, her activism was not just about suffrage, it's about racial violence. And we've probably all heard about this before. The misnamed Arkansas race riot, which was in fact a massacre, not a race riot. She comes down to Arkansas. She has to sneak down to Arkansas dressed as a little old woman so that she can go visit not just the African-American men who were incarcerated, but their families, right? Their wives, their children, those folks. And then she goes and she self-publishes a pamphlet about that for 50 cents, which was probably a considerable amount of money for some people in 1950. Now, the reason why I put archive.org on here for you is because if you want to go take a look at this, you can. Archive.org is free. So you can go on to archive.org. You can look up Arkansas Race Riot. I would put it in parentheses to make sure you get exactly what you're looking for. And you can flip through it. You can download it. You can use it as a PDF file. I often use it in my classes so students get a really good sense of what kind of information she is able to glean, not just from the men who have been incarcerated, but also their families. And I really harp on that because one of the things that we don't think about in the Arkansas Race Massacre is the impact that it had on Black women. So if you want to read an article that deals with that, this book by Guy Lancaster, I know some of you on here know him, but I have a chapter in this book that is titled Women and the 1919 Elaine Massacre, because that is a perspective that we do not consider. And it's an important perspective. It costs Black men, but it also costs Black women. Things like, and in many instances, the cost was quite literal. When they want to go see their loved ones in prison, I think they had to pay like $1 or $2 to the jailer. These are sharecroppers. They don't have that kind of money, right? But what does it mean to be involved in a situation where people from Arkansas, from across the river in Mississippi, they come over and they start randomly shooting Black people because they're going to riot and they're going to take over and all of these other sort of ridiculous things because they dared protest for fair wages. And that's a lot of the thinking that informs a lot of people at this point in history. I think this is one of my last slides, and I think we can move on to talking after that. We know again that Ida B. Wells was a Republican and she ran for office on the numerous occasions. This is just an example here. Vote for Ida B. Wells Barnett, delegate to the Republican National Convention in 1928. And mind you now, she dies 3 years later. So she is in her mid to late 60s at this point, still just as active as she's ever been, still advocating for Black rights, because even though women get the right to vote, what does that mean for Black women? It means that Black women are more free to vote in Chicago where she lives, but that's certainly not the case in Arkansas, nor is that the case in most of the South. And again, the Republican Party is the progressive party for African Americans, and depending on where you are, like Arkansas, a lot of Black people are loyal to the Republican Party in the late 1960s and the 1970s. So this activism for Ida B. Wells Barnett, it's not just a one-stop deal. It's lifelong activism. And as you saw by the countless other examples in the book, it's her activism from the late 19th century up until her death in the early 1930s that continues to inform other activists in the 20th and in the 21st century. So with that, I'm going to stop and let's just open it up to some discussions about your reactions to the book. What did you learn? What did you know? You may have just read this and just thought, I know all of this. I'm just going to show up, which is fine. We're glad to see you. But I'm always curious about how this kind of history impacts people, because we all know that this is not stuff that we're commonly taught. I wanted to believe at a certain point that was changing, but for reasons I'm not willing to get into, I do have my doubts. But what are your thoughts? What did you gain from this? What can you share with the group to help us have the most fruitful discussion possible? And don't be shy, because I know most of you on here. I know George.
Dr. Jones, Boris Pearson, how are you this evening?
Hi, how are you?
Great. I didn't hear you mention anything about her husband and how they met. I know he was a lawyer. The book mentions briefly about him, because he was kind of instrumental in helping her with some of her activism. Could you kind of mention anything about him, or how did?
Absolutely. And I think what's important is that she was married to a man who was an activist in his own right, and he was an educated man. And I would say what's important about the way this story is told is that, number one, Ida B. Wells is the center of the story, which when we talk about civil rights activism, that's usually not the case. So for example, people love to talk about Martin Luther King, but they don't talk about the fact that Coretta Scott King led him to his activism.
Right.
So his skills as an attorney were extremely helpful to her in her activism. So there was a story, of course, about her selling the pens, right? And the FBI, this woman has an FBI file. It's because of her husband, Ferdinand, that she knows that they really can't stop her from selling these pens. So in many ways, he is an incredibly important figure in her life, not just as her husband, but because he's an attorney and because he has his own set of connections that assist her. But I think it needs to be made abundantly clear that she didn't become an activist because of him. She was already doing that work. Come on. Well, I want you to ask questions, but I wrote stuff down, so we can do it that way too. But I want to hear from you. You all read the book. What do you think?
Well, actually, I didn't read this book, but I'm eager to, especially knowing that it's by her great-granddaughter, because I think those family stories have a power in transmission, and they speak in ways to young people, because young people have been spoken to and speak to their own forebears and family elders, and they listen to stories from it and about those kinds of conversations. I was very interested too in this relationship she had with her husband, and I thank you for what you've just been able to share on that front. Here's an unrelated question to that. As I read her writing, especially the Arkansas Race Riot, which I've read through pretty thoroughly, and I found myself wanting to hear her voice and know how she spoke, so I can give her cadence to the words. There's something very powerful, poetic almost, rhythmic in her speaking. She would have been a hell of a preacher too. Well, in fact, she was just in print. And
absolutely. Well, I mean, yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And I think had we been around in the 19-teens and the 1920s or whatever, we probably would have had plenty of opportunity to hear her speak. Because if you do a search in the African-American newspaper, if you do a search in newspapers.com, which has all kinds of newspapers in it, her name comes up all the time. All the time. She was always going somewhere to give a talk. So we may not be able to hear her voice in the 21st century, but it seems like a whole lot of people did in the 20th. Yeah. And I think what would be wonderful if there was any chance at all that somebody has a recording somewhere of Ida B. Wells Barnett, wouldn't that be a tremendous find?
It would be so much so that
Yeah. And she wasn't a big woman. I think she was what, 5 feet or less? And so when I think of her, because of everything that she did, I think of her, I don't know, as somebody who's my height. I'm 5'8", 5'9". And so I imagine her being this large, tall person, but she was barely 5 feet tall and possessed all of this power and sense of self-awareness and sense of what was right and what was unjust. And of course, she didn't come to that on her own, right? I mean, her family informed that, instilled that in her. And we're talking about her coming from a family of people who were enslaved, and she herself was briefly enslaved. But they came out of that situation informing her that you are not an inferior and you're entitled, you're worth something, you are somebody.
Where was she, her family and she enslaved? I'm sure it says that in the book, but
It does in Mississippi. In Mississippi. Her grandmother actually had a farm after emancipation, and her family had a lot to do with establishing the one-room school that became Russell College. Still exists today. Still exists today. So you can go down. In fact, with the Holly Springs is only about an hour, maybe an hour and a half outside of Memphis. It's not that far away. It doesn't take that long to get there. What are some other insights about the book?
I noticed too, Doctor, that she did have several philanthropists who were helping her to the finance, because she was traveling. I know, when she was out in California one time, I was reading in another book, she wrote back to one of her philanthropists to help her get back home to Memphis or something. So I'm thinking that she had a lot of benefactors working, in the background that was helping her to move across the states and the world to talk about the issues of Black suppression. Yeah.
Yes, you are absolutely correct. And I want to be clear, not all those benefactors were Black. Right? We got to be careful about that, right? Because we tend to think of them as this us or them paradigm, and it's a bit more complicated than that, right? There were often people who didn't necessarily want to be publicly known for supporting her causes, who supported them. Some people just didn't care, right? So like, for example, with her involvement in the NAACP, the earliest years of the NAACP, that money came from white folks. And the first presidents of the NAACP were white. And for a very, very long time, that organization was supported by white benefactors, some Black benefactors, but let's be real, who really had all the money? All right. Because there are always people, regardless of their racial background, who want to see justice prevail. And sometimes the best and often the most important way for them to contribute to that is by financial support.
I think what really amazes me is that, I'm just discovering her. We didn't learn about her in grade school. I grew up in school in the 1960s. We didn't study, Ida B. Wells, and I'm just curious why a lot of schools were named after her. I know that, Sears built a lot of, Sears Roebuck founded, I know they built a lot of the Black schools in the South. They helped, but we didn't get her name on a lot of the schools, and that's something that I wondered about, you know?
No, I completely, and I know what you're referencing. You're referencing the Rosenwald schools, and there were like 300 plus Rosenwald schools in Arkansas. One of my former graduate students, who's now a graduate student at Cornell University in New York, wrote her master's thesis on that. I think it's because we forget. Number one, we forget, and number two, we tend not to think women's work, and particularly women of color's work, is as important. I mean, again, back to the example of the civil rights movement. Who are the names that most people can commonly pull out of their hats? Right? They tend to be men. They tend to be men, and they tend to overlook the people who were quite productive activists in their own right and quite well known in their day. We don't learn about them because it doesn't occur to people to think outside of certain paradigms about who else was a civil rights activist. All right. And Ida B. Wells wasn't the only one. She's just one of the ones we know.
Right. Yeah.
She's just one of the ones we know. Yeah. But I think that has a lot to do with it. And, you know, I was in school in the 70s and the 80s and the early 90s. We didn't learn about her either. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of stuff. There's a lot of stuff like that people don't learn, which is why, to me, the business of education has to go beyond the school. It has to go beyond the school. One of the things that I have great disdain for is when students graduate. I'm at Arkansas State University and at commencement, and they say, Dr. Jones Branch, I'm never going to learn anything ever again. And it just makes me sprout yet another gray hair for someone to say that, because I don't understand this disdain for learning, particularly if it comes from people from underrepresented backgrounds who historically have not had the same opportunities.
Right, yeah.
And I don't mean that just in terms of race, right? This is Arkansas. There are a whole lot of white folks in Arkansas who were the first in their families to go to college and to access certain kinds of opportunities. But, you know, you just deciding that you're going to shut your brain down and not learn something else. And of course, it really doesn't work that way, right? If you're gonna get a new job, you're gonna have to learn how to do something, or you won't have that job long. So it sort of seeps in there whether you want it to or not. But I think what's important now is that technology has made this information so much more available. And I think what's also really special and important is that digitization has revolutionized the way we access information. You know, I mean, we can find these sorts of images. We can find letters written by, you know, between, I don't know, I.G. Wells Barnett and W.E.B. Du Bois fairly easily online now. So a lot of it in my mind is, if you don't know, you don't want to know. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of this stuff can be accessed fairly easily.
No, you go ahead. I'd like to make a point about the style of the book.
Sure.
I think that we were talking about not having known about history and Ida B. Wells in high school, but I think that and I think she may have done this purposely. The style of the book, the look of the book, the ease of read, and the pictures and just the formatting of it. I think today you may have young adults, teenagers who may not pick up a book, but the book, the cover of the book just attracted me to begin with, and it invited me into the book. So I didn't know if that struck anyone else.
I love it. And this Miss Enoch, she's another one of my former students. I quite agree. I love sparkly, engaging colors. When I see that, I think, well, I want to know what's on the next page, and then on the page after that. And I always tell people I think I'm sort of stuck between generations. I'm part of the generation that knows what it's like to use a payphone. Uh, but I've got to toe in with the generation who has only a toe now, a toe, my smallest toe, in with the generation that knows how to use a smartphone, right? And so I think it is all about appeal. And I don't think that it's necessarily that younger people aren't absorbing information or don't want to engage information. I think they do it differently because they live in a very different kind of world. And so if you want somebody of a certain age, younger than me, to engage something like this, you may have to make it digital. In fact, I think it is. But that's where they're going to meet that book because that's all they've ever known. But no, I mean, I love the style of it as well. Okay, so somebody read it as an ebook, cool. I like the images. I love the fact that so many primary source documents have been digitized because you can put them in these books so that people can see and hear what's going on, or take a look at the newspaper that she's mentioning, and not just look at what she's doing and what she said or where she traveled, but also engage the times in which she lived. One of the things I love to do is to look at newspaper ads from the 1920s to see the kinds of things that people are buying. And you're like, they did what with that? What? Really? Don't they know that'll kill you? Well, they didn't know that. They didn't know that. We know that now. They didn't know that back then. Any other observations? I'm trying really hard not to monopolize. I really am. But please, what are observations? And thank you, Ms. Enoch. That struck me as well.
So I am an Arkansas educator, and even in my teachings or lessons, this would have been great to have in my classroom. This is a history book in and of itself. We talked about the primary sources. There's a timeline in it, and I am not the biggest history fan. I just don't, that's not my jam. But besides the cover and the way the book was outlined, the pictures, I was trying to read the articles, knowing good and well, I couldn't really see it very well, but I was just intrigued at just, the authenticity of the actual, documents, because I'm not young, I'm not that old either, but the generation I grew up, I'm not a digital person. Like if I need a book, I'd rather read it in my hands. But the option, like the students that we serve now, this is what they have.
What they know.
And so I think it's not that generation they're not, you just have to tell them about it. They're not going to go searching for it. But I think if you put it in their hands, like I stumbled upon this on Facebook, this event. And I don't know, I guess it was a Facebook algorithm because I've been reading a lot of books lately. And so I guess it just so happened, but I was like, I've never heard of this. This is my first time seeing anything. And so I went and found the book. It was local to me. So I just went to the university and got it. And I read through it. And I think the most fascinating things were the actual documents and the pictures. And then I was thinking to myself, when Michelle Duster I think she did it on purpose, she talked about the past and in the present, I'm like, history is repeating itself. I'm like, here we go again. And it's like, if you don't learn from it, like I said, we are doomed to repeat it. And we haven't learned from it. So that's why it's continuing, and I think we as adults and wherever our age range is, we have to be the ones to help out the younger generations, because they're not going to go looking for it, and it's not going to be in the schools. The schools have their own curriculum or whatever, whoever had the cheapest rate or whoever had the most, whatever. This is not going to be in the history book. And so one of my goals is, now that I have a little bit of leeway into how, things I want to teach, I want to get my students more interested in things that's not only, that affects them, and they're marginalized too. And I want them to have an understanding like, hey, just because we're marginalized, you don't have to say that way. You can use your voice. And that's what I liked about Ida B. Wells Barnett. What they call her, a Negro agitator. And I was like, she was just speaking she was tired and she was mad and she was upset. That doesn't make her an agitator. It just makes her, human. She knows what's right and she knows what's wrong. And she was speaking up for the underdog, to say. And I was just that. And I think that's why I don't like history, because it makes me upset. And I kind of have to calm myself. I'm like, okay.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you, I think you raised some really, really good points, because, how do you desensitize yourself to the history, particularly when you come from, certain kind of backgrounds and you can see yourself and your family and your people, in these histories. But I think we also have to think on the other side of that. As a historian, when I write history, and I write mainly the history of Black people and Black women, I will never focus exclusively on the marginalization, because their lives were more than that. Their lives were much, much more than that. And I think if you look at the book, yes, there's racial violence, there's racial discrimination, there are all sorts of terrible things going on. But guess what else is going on? There's Black political activism, right? There's Black institution building, there's Black entrepreneurship, there's Black resistance, even if it means you pick up your stuff, you leave Memphis, Tennessee after the 1892 lynching, and then you move across the river to Arkansas, right? Or you keep going till you get to Oklahoma. Or if you're in Arkansas, some of these people left the country altogether. There's a whole Back to Africa movement out of Arkansas in the late 19th century. So it's not just the oppression, there is power there as well. And also, just to be all the way clear, the reason why the marginalization and the oppression occurred, because there's power there, right? You don't have to create laws to marginalize people who lack power. What would be the point, right? Wouldn't they just naturally and organically be marginalized, right? I mean, when you think of the 3 men who were murdered in 1892, they were murdered because they were business owners and they were doing well, right? If you look at a lot of these so-called race riots, guess who they got rid of? The Black people who were doing well. And in terms of my students, George, or you're on mute.
Yeah, I was inspired by what Jessica Wiley was saying. I would love to know where she teaches, and I'm thrilled that she's in the classroom. But your students as well, because your students have the age and ability, the wherewithal, and the time, maybe some of the technical chops to pull off that kind of website and that kind of audio presentation. That's part of what was behind my wishing I could hear the voice of Ida B. herself.
Well,
so, to all teachers, I'm sending that.
I can speak to that very quickly. I'm a history professor, and increasingly I don't require my undergraduates to write papers because I want them to engage technology. I want them to engage technology. And now there is a new technology, I don't know what it's called, but you can get these, you've seen it, you can get these old images and there's something you can do, but you can get their lips moving and they're talking. It's eerie, it's creepy, but it's interesting. And for me, it's the kind of technology that could very well engage people who typically wouldn't like history. Right? There are ways to make it come alive. And I, for a long time, have been a huge proponent of technology in history classrooms, just because of all the different kinds of things that we can do with it to get people to understand that engaging history, being in a history class, it does not mean you have to sit there and listen to me behind a pulpit for 50 minutes. It doesn't mean that. I don't want to do that. And so that's why I so eagerly engage these different kinds of technologies. Number one, I want to know what's new. And it's not just about the young people learning from me, it's me learning from the young people. You know,
Right.
when I first started using Zoom, I didn't know what to do, but somebody who was 21 years old did. You know, so for me, I think of it as an intellectual exchange. You know, it's not me just preaching from on high. What I know really well, but what my students know, they know really well. So how can we educate and enlighten each other to create this product in the history classroom? So I'm like, no, if you want to write a paper, go ahead. But if you have some other really kind of funky, interesting way to tell the story, graphics, movie, whatever, do that, because that's what's really going to pull people in and get them to rethink what they thought a history classroom was. What else? What are some other thoughts that you have here? Ms. Scranton, you had something to say. Let's have it.
Well, I was hoping you would say a bit about her journaling, because to have not just the public record of the speeches and the pamphlets and the newspaper, but then to have her own thoughts. And at what age did she begin her journals? Is it throughout her whole life? What can you tell us about the private writing?
Well, many women journal at this point in the 20th century, but I think for Black women like Ida B. Wells Barnett, there's the journal, there are the journals we have, and then there's the stuff that was extracted from the journals, right? Because if you think about who these women were, I mean, they're the leaders of the race, right? The race for many people rises and falls with these women. So even in their private journals, they were very careful about what they left behind. They didn't want their reputation sullied. And she even says in the book, the reputation is all I have. She says, my reputation is all I have. So, I think what we forget sometimes when we look at historical figures is that they led real lives. They got mad at people, they got in fights with people, maybe they cussed people out, all of that. And I'm not just trying to be facetious, I'm trying to be real, right? But there are some of those behaviors that can be so potentially dangerous for them and the work that they're doing and the legacy that they try to leave behind. Do we ever get the fullest sense of who they are? But what she did tell us was pretty powerful, and it told us a lot about the depth and the breadth of her activism in ways that still, they're at Chicago, University of Chicago. They still to this day inform activists. That's why we're still talking about her in 2022. But pretty powerful stuff. Pretty powerful stuff. And sometimes they do reveal some of their difficulties. So for example, I know that there's at least one book about Mary Church Terrell, and they were contemporaries. I don't think they liked each other very much, but they were contemporaries. And Mary Church Terrell talked about the murders of these three men in 1892 in her journal as well. She was friends with these men as well. She was from Memphis. She also, I think in one place, talks about the loss of a child. So some of those things do seep in there, but just because of the way Black women were regarded pretty much by everybody at that point, they had to be really, really careful, because the politics of respectability were real. The politics of respectability were really real. How you present yourself as a singular individual. This is ridiculous, but nonetheless true, reflected on the rest of the race. They reflected on the rest of the race. So they understood that in this project of uplifting the race, they had to be careful.
And Doctor, you made a very good point there, because I did read that she made the preacher write a letter about her her respectability, that because she said that she wanted to protect her name. She wanted to make sure that, you know, that she wasn't getting discredited, you know, and so, you know, she demanded him to write that letter about the lies that that you know, that went on, that he was, I guess, preaching from his pulpit, I guess, I don't know, you know.
And if you notice, she was very generous with him once he did that. But but even if she hadn't been, because he was a man, there was far more at risk for her than there was for him. I mean, once I mean, and in the late 19th, 20th century, once really any woman's reputation was lost, it was game over. But it was doubly worse for Black women, whom people assumed to be the worst of the worst anyway. I mean, the stereotypes ran rampant about Black women, and quite frankly, some of them have not gone anywhere in the 21st century. But in order for her to do the work that she did, to have the credibility she possessed, to even get the benefactors she had to be careful. And let us not forget that her being outspoken in the way she was at this time was dangerous. It was dangerous. You know, she didn't lead this comfortable, cushy life where people weren't constantly harassing and threatening her. She assumed all of that with her activism. But what we admire about her is the fact that it never deterred her from that activism. And a lot of other people, you got to think about it. You know, remember, she talked about going to churches, Black churches, and you know they have the command of tons of people who were not willing to stand with her. They did not want to stand with her because they were not willing to assume the cost or the risk that came along with that. You know, so she paid some high, and I think those are important discussions to have. What does this activism cost? She got run out of Memphis, right? They told her, if you come back, we'll kill you for printing the truth, right? At a time when America didn't want to hear that kind of truth from that kind of person. When she visited those men in Little Rock, she had to sneak into Arkansas. She didn't show up and say, I'm here, let's kick it. She had to sneak into Arkansas. They would have killed her. That's real. But none of that deterred her, you know? Well, we spent a whole wonderful hour together.
Yeah, I was gonna say that seems like a really good note to end on. Thank you so much, Cherisse, for guiding that discussion. That was really fruitful. Today's program was again made possible with support from the American Library Association and the National Endowment for the Humanities. And just a reminder, when you leave the meeting, if you'll please take a minute to take that survey for us. And I wanted to just let folks know about our next and final program in the series. It'll be on August 30th at 6:30 here on Zoom. And we'll be joined by Dr. Wendy Lucas of the University of Central Arkansas to discuss The Once and Future Witches, one of my favorite books that I've read in the last few years. The program's co-hosted by the Thompson branch of the Cal's Library System. And copies of the title are available by registering for next month's discussion. I am going to drop a link right here in case you're interested. It is a fiction book, and it's based around three sisters that are suffrage activists and also witches in a fictional version of New England. So it's pretty interesting. So yeah, thank you all again for attending today's program, and I hope to see you on August 30th.
Have a good evening, everybody. Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Doctor.